1602 hours. April 15th, 2539 military calendar Meade-Trome system. Planet boundary, Iran mountain range. Arthur crawled on his belly toward the crest of the mountain, pausing to observe, listen, and catch his breath. He'd been low crawling for about 200 meters. Although they flew to the base of the mountain, one could never be certain who or what was watching. He inhaled deeply and turned his head down the dried-up tributary that meandered into the fertile valley below. He could still see Spartan 065, Sheila, throwing sheets of thermally refractive camouflage netting over the Pelican dropship at the base of mountain range. As the security specialist on the team, she took her job very seriously, and he was grateful for the precaution. He also knew she'd continue to linger as the rear guard to keep the back door open in case they needed to exfil in a hurry. The Spartan commander turned back uphill and finished his crawl toward Teal 4's hide, spreading out several hundred meters. "Sit rep," he whispered and began to work on his secondary position. He got on his hands and knees, beginning to scoop handfuls of earth and pushed them toward the uphill side of the cut he was making. Belly scrapes were hastily made firing positions that provided little in the way of cover or concealment, just enough to provide a modicum of protection if the need arose. "The two hinge heads are done with their pissing contest." A disembodied voice came from his helmet's audio emitters. He squinted at a cleared position between the two massive Covenant ships, and his armor's onboard computer magnified the viewplate to its maximum resolution. He could make out a single, unmoving body lying bare on the desert floor. "Interesting development, though," Cal said. Another elite came out of the crowd and challenged the winner of the first duel. "Wonder what that's about." "I suppose it doesn't matter much. If the Covenant are fighting with each other in the middle of a battle, I'll chalk that up to a win," as he continued observing the distant wasteland past the mountain range. He could see Sheila's FOF approaching the other side of Cal's hide, 100 meters away and beyond an outcropping of dead trees, clinging to life at an extreme angle that hung over the cliff below. Although the trio had rarely worked together during both their time on Reach and in theater, the team dynamics of all Spartans were ingrained into them from day one. Joining Cal at her observation post, Arthur had taken a position on one flank, knowing Sheila would cover the other. Arthur remembered what Cal had mentioned in her fragmentary report earlier. "See if we can enter in through hull breaches in the damaged craft," she had said to him. He moved his gaze from the dissipating masses between the two cruisers toward the lateral lines of the left craft. Cal was right. There were large sections of the hull missing, presumably from either Archer missile strikes or from the merchant marine vessels generously donated by the citizens of Boundary. Big enough for a strike team to enter, he thought, if it weren't for the thousands of ground troops, turret emplacements, and flights of banshees hovering lazily over the ship like flies around a corpse. "Cal, even for us, that's a little crazy." "I know," she finished. "Hear me out. Based on the activity that I've seen from their aerial and mobile ground patrols, there's a way we can get in and out quick with a few cords of Octa, or a Fury if we've got one." Cal was referring to the commonly used but extremely expensive clean alternative to a thermonuclear solution. She continued, "There's a gap in their patrol to the northwest, off the port side of the damaged craft. If we can deploy a battalion of Marines and supplement them with some armor support and the militia, we could make this work." Arthur shifted in his hastily made position and inched forward to see past an outcropping of boulders. Beyond, he could see the edges of a sheer cliff and the brackish waters that lay past the crashing surf, that demarked the edge of the singular continent on Boundary. Farther to the north was the city of Sanctuary. With any luck, the Covenant would ignore the city and leave them to their evacuation. It seemed to be strategically insignificant. Sanctuary was a city of medium size, surrounded to the south and west by small towns with economies supported by fishing operations. To their north and east, mining towns peppered the otherwise inhospitable desert. From the initial briefing, he knew that Boundary was mainly a cash crop colony which fed several inner colonies. The majority of the 19 million people lived and worked either in the capital of Sanctuary or spread out along the thousands of kilometers of fertile land spanning across the continent below the equator. "It'll have to be at night for this to even remotely work," he said tersely. Arthur could tell where Cal was going with this. A lot of lives were going to be lost in the feint. The question arose in his mind, and one he knew the leadership would ask as well. Was it worth it? We'll need to skirt the Banshee patrols and enter from the cliffs. He turned his head farther down the mountain range and looked for Sheila. Unsurprised, he couldn't actually see the Spartan, but he knew she was there. Sheila, raise General Grant. Let him know we're going to need a spy drone at this waypoint. He looked back toward the damaged Covenant vessel and then to the cliffs. His onboard computer tagged a waypoint. And a company from his militia battalion would be better. As he said that last part out loud, he realized how well that would be received in the general's ready room. Sheila relayed the request and waited for the militia leader's response. It came several minutes later. An orderly was sent to retrieve the general. Undoubtedly, he was busy with a myriad of other things. It was no easy task to detail a division's worth of troops, vehicles, and equipment over hundreds of square kilometers of ground, let alone doing it from a bunker, hiding from the specter of a plasma bombardment. While the trio lay in their scrapes and hides observing the enemy, they took the opportunity to discuss their options. It was fairly straightforward. Send a battalion and air wing of shock troops over the mountain range toward the pair of Covenant ships at sunset. From the city to the base of the mountain range, they would pilot or drive their vehicles and enter the desert beyond through a saddle several clicks east from his current position. It had a gently rising slope that most any military vehicle could traverse. The Covenant air patrols would undoubtedly spot the massed formation coming and engage, at which time their own broadsword and Nandao squadrons would engage and screen their advance. Confident that the air patrols wouldn't notice his movement, Arthur leaned to one side of his belly scrape and set his assault rifle on the ground next to him. Reaching behind his helmet, he grabbed the barrel of an SRS-99AM sniper rifle and flicked the bipod situated at the end of the chassis. After a soft clunk, the rifle was laid on a flat-faced boulder a few centimeters away. With a sweeping motion, he studied the terrain beyond the saddle on the far side of the ridgeline. There was a small hovering outpost situated halfway up the winding dirt road with a few sleepy-looking grunts manning the plasma turret emplacement. The outpost was comprised of a few crates of reserve plasma, a tank for their methane reserves, and a donut-shaped platform that rose several meters off the deck. Situated within the curved donut were two jackal snipers, cradling beam rifles in the crooks of their scaly arms. Light resistance on the approach for now. He set a marker on the outpost to share to his team and would pass along his helmet cam footage back at base. He swept the powerful rifle scope to his left, north by northwest, and saw an endless procession of vehicles. Wraiths, ghosts, shadow troop carriers, and, to his dismay, a pair of massive, ultra-heavy platforms called Scarabs by the UNSC. The lumbering behemoths towered several dozen meters over their smaller complement of ground vehicles. Flying lazy circles above each Scarab was an escort wing of even more Banshees. They were gearing up for the final show, with at least one cruiser already parked over the city. This would spell disaster if they waited much longer to take out their prize. Thankfully, Captain Fulton delivered more than a modest amount of both troop support vehicles and direct action platforms toward the defensive boundary. The mass of troops would conduct a textbook pincer maneuver. One would crest the mountain range from the south from the city's edge, while the other would be airlifted via D-80 Condor heavy-lift transport craft to the east. Meanwhile, Arthur, Cal, and Sheila, along with a handful of ODSTs, would take a handful of Pelicans from their firebase fabricated just days earlier and swing around toward the cliffs to the west. If all went according to plan, Teal Force would enter the damaged battlecruiser from the gaping holes in its lateral lines, make their way toward the interior of the ship, and hide their octanitrocubane charges within the hull. When the mission objective was met, Arthur would signal to the troop commanders to conduct a tactical withdrawal and stand by for a fireworks show. Arthur ran the plan through his head again, cringing inwardly at the notion that he'd be ordering so many good soldiers to their deaths. This was the part he wasn't looking forward to. In much of his service as a Spartan, he'd been just fine following orders and supporting his team leader. John must have seen something in him, though. The message relayed through Admiral Cole's fleet was clear, and he knew if John had confidence in him to see this through, then he would do everything in his power to carry out his duty. Starting to miss those destroyers right about now. Arthur decided to break the tension of waiting on a response from the brass. Sunset would be here in just a few hours, which left little time for the troop commanders to marshal resources. Sheila could be very persuasive, though. If Cal had concluded that this was their best bet to eliminate a Covenant naval vessel, then he knew Sheila had too. The majority of the hostile forces would continue to be tied up in the city, rooting out civilians and military hardpoints for destruction. Arthur knew from previous engagements that if the Covenant didn't outright glass a population in the first few hours, they'd be here to stay, for reasons unknown to him and to Oni. Some ODST drop pods right on their foreheads would be a good wake-up call, Sheila said back, still waiting on General Grant. Let's assume he's game for it, Arthur said. Cal, grab anything you need from the Pelican. You're staying here. And what will you be doing, Teal Leader? We'll get your exfil set up closer to ready hour. Stay here and continue reconnaissance of the cruisers. Sheila, on me. We're heading back to base. Raise Lieutenant Green. We need to borrow a few fire teams from his platoon. A green light flashed on Arthur's HUD to indicate her acknowledgement. About 200 meters away, he could make out a faint human-shaped figure slowly emerging from the sandy ground and moving carefully back toward their Pelican's concealed position farther down the mountain. The team leader followed suit and rose from his position, first on hands and knees, then crawling backward for several meters to now silhouette of his figure on the skyline. He low-crawled 20 meters down a finger in the mountain, doubled back slightly, and brushed Cal on the bottom of her sabaton to indicate departure of last friendly. Arthur jogged over to the now unconcealed Pelican, Sheila already in the cockpit going through a hasty pre-flight checklist. Arthur did Cal the courtesy of grabbing a few ration bars and an extra canteen. Their suits could recycle their waste excreted from urine or sweat, so there wasn't much to worry about hunger or thirst, but it was wise to stay prepared. He didn't know how long she'd have to remain at her position. He moved into the rear bay of the uncovered Pelican and gathered up a few items into a rucksack. Sheila, start her up. I'll be right back, he said, and turned to walk down the ramp. He knew Cal better than to expect her to ask for something. She was a sniper, a damn good one, and he knew she took her role very seriously, same as Sheila. If Cal was ordered to monitor the situation over the mountain range, she wouldn't leave her post for anything short of direct engagement or an order from him, whether that be 5 minutes or 5 days, still and solid as a rock. He was glad to be reunited with the pair and with Solomon. The three were masters of their craft, and it was now Arthur's duty to keep them alive. With an armful of goodies for Cal in tow, he continued to scramble up the loose shale of the mountain. A solitary click went off in his earpiece, moving into position to negotiate a jump from one outcropping to another. One click meant she was ready for takeoff, only waiting on him before spooling up the jet engines and move out. He quickly nestled himself under the outcropping he just jumped to, looked down the mountain to his comrade, and gave her the go-ahead. A single line of sight transmission on the reverse slope of the Covenant warships would be virtually impossible to catch. Although the chances were slim, they weren't zero, so they were still observing strict radio protocol. Teal Leader garbled transmission from General Grant. It doesn't sound good. Patch it through. A burst of static punctuated Arthur's helmet, followed by a string of expletives, terminated by a long burst of semi-automatic pistol fire. Teal 3, my wife's convoy was under attack. Another wash of static interrupted the transmission. Could use CT support. No other units on our own. There's another platoon pinned down. Need extract. Track might. Another burst of semi-automatic pistol fire finished the sentence. Arthur and Sheila waited a long pause for any additional information, fearing the worst. After what felt like an hour, but, in reality, was only a few moments, the transmission came to life again. Headed to Bank. South. Grant out. The transmission terminated with a grim finality. Arthur emerged from the outcropping and booked it down the remainder of the slope. Well, Cal, looks like you might get your op after all, Arthur mused, leaping over a pile of treacherous-looking shale. If we can get there in time to save the general, he might feel obliged to return the favor. Smoke billowed from destroyed vehicles all around the boulevard. He was trapped and huddled behind an improvised barricade made of a car door, some concrete remnants, and a food cart pulled over from the curb. A burning warthog lay flipped on its side a few strides down the street. Shit, he thought to himself. How could I be so careless? Why did I have to be so reckless? Several minutes ago, General Grant had been situated comfortably in the confines of the Vault, as it was becoming known, coordinating troop deployments and bolstering their faltering lines. His adjutant burst through a throng of political aides to pass him a comm piece. Without even putting it to his ear, he could already hear the shouts and rattling of automatic fire, all too familiar in his military career. Repeat, can't maintain position, we'll try to reroute. Adj, what the hell is this? The young officer struggled and huffed to catch his breath. Sir, it's one of the convoy commanders in charge of evacuating civilians to Rally Point Bravo. They were ambushed by a Covenant patrol and they're pinned down. And what the hell does this have to do with me? If you haven't noticed, Captain, shit's hitting the fan all over the planet. Yes, sir. He stiffened at the rebuke. It's just, your wife and son were a part of that convoy. A sharp pain shot through his chest like a javelin, and an icy cold chill ran down his sweaty back. He tried to gulp, but discovered a lack of saliva left in his dry mouth. How can you possibly know that? Elaine and his son's location were need-to-know information for only a few people in the city. Shortly after the news came from Fleet Comm, he arranged for his family to be housed in a military safe house located in the suburbs of an old town, on the south fringes of the city. What the hell were they doing in the thick of the fighting? Sir, this evacuation run was one of the last ones on the list, the officer said, and dug out a computer pad from a cargo pocket. The screen was slick with sweat that had bled through his pants and onto the glass screen. He wiped it away quickly and brought it to life. It was for the personnel on the list the lieutenant governor gave me yesterday. When the convoy commander identified his unit on the site rep, I cross-referenced that with the associated manifest. It became clear to him how this happened. His beautiful Elaine was suffering because of him once again. Guilt racked his senses. His breath quickened, short and shallow. He gripped the leather chair next to his workstation to steady himself. She had done what she was supposed to and hid with their only son. And now they might both be gone. What's the convoy's status now? Sir, they picked her up on Highway 10 about an hour ago, then headed north and then east toward Rally Point Bravo. They started taking effective fire en route to the Rally Point, and now they're attempting to move to Rally Point Echo. He sifted through the overload of information in his head, and recalled the location of Rally Point Echo. It was an abandoned factory near the southeast corner of Sanctuary, with a plussed-up company of his own militia, complete with a few warthogs to man the perimeter in case of attack. Good, good, he said. It was as if a truck was pulled off his chest. And where are they now? The adjutant tapped on the screen several times and then raised a finger to his ear. Corporal, sitrep, over. General Grant stared at the young man. An eternity passed by as he followed the path of a stubborn bead of sweat daring to fall off the man's brow. Nothing, sir, I can't raise them. Well, damn it, keep trying. Without waiting for a response, he gathered his things and made his intentions known to Governor Huxley and her staff. Nearing the elevator back to the surface, he snagged a slick plate carrier, just enough to stop some shrapnel or a glancing shot by an energy weapon. No time to waste. While pulling on the bulky body armor, he made a few quick calls over the radio and was on his way. General Grant had told his fellow staffers his intentions and gathered a handful of troopers to escort him around the city. Not 10 minutes ago, he and 4 junior militiamen made their way through the basement headquarters, up the elevator to the atrium and onto the street where there was a warthog waiting for him. Sir Corporal Valdez, I'll be your driver. General Grant situated himself into the familiar seat and looked at the young Marine's face. Nice to see you here, son, he replied, and began to scan the street ahead for threats. Get us en route to Rally Point Echo. 8 clicks to the east through Tranquility Boulevard. The young corporal gave a quick acknowledgement and began barreling down the street, dodging the occasional radioactive Covenant carbine round or stray plasma bolt. General Grant began to pull out his personal sidearm, a modified M6D.50 caliber pistol. His former commanding officer had gifted it to him years ago while serving as the man's executive officer. He looked up while unsnapping the holster's release and saw a pod of grunt foot soldiers. As he began to tighten his throat to shout at the driver, the wind was sucked out of his lungs. One of the Covenant soldiers had been situated behind an abandoned vehicle waiting for its comrades when it heard the Warthog approaching. The diminutive soldier, now lying in wait, hefted a plasma grenade down the boulevard and melted to the concrete beneath it. Before General Grant could react, the Warthog rolled over the grenade and exploded in a ball of white-hot flames. The vehicle's rear went skyward, causing it to flip end over end. He ejected from his seat and slid to a halt on the ground 5 meters away. Disoriented and suffering from a searing pain in his left thigh, he forced himself to crawl behind the nearest hard cover. He began to stand with gritted teeth as he suffered in quiet agony. Looking down, he could see rivulets of blood trickle down to his boots, staining the leather. Gathering his wits about him, General Grant reached for his sidearm once again. To his amazement, it was still in the holster. The last thing he remembered before impacting the ground was unlatching the leather guard on the holster. He looked around the boulevard now that he was coming to his senses, the thrum in his head and eyes subsiding just enough to focus. To his left, he could see fighting on both sides of the street. Although obscured by wrecked vehicles, he could see the telltale flashes of dazzling yellow muzzles and complementing blue bolts of plasma tearing through the air. To his right was the burning heap of the Warthog, now completely upside down, resting on the bent M41 LEAAG turret. Pinned under the turret, however, was the vehicle's third occupant. It was a middle-aged private, no doubt a militiaman picked up by the UNSC driver to get the general around the battlefield. A crimson patch of blood pooled around the fallen soldier's belly. He crouched behind a food cart and took a knee. He stared in disbelief that this fellow citizen was dead because of him. Why did he have to be so arrogant to request a driver right now? He swallowed his rage and self-pity and blinked hard. Shifting focus to the center of the boulevard, he could see and hear an MA-5B assault rifle rattling bursts of 7.62 automatic fire. It was Corporal Valdez, valiantly fighting for his life behind a half-melted civilian vehicle. The general could see the young Marine poking his head in and out of cover, firing controlled bursts and dodging plasma rounds in a valiant last stand. Around him lay only death and destruction, no friendlies close enough to provide support. The militia leader stood from his concealed position in a crouched, ready position and set his shoulders. There were 4 grunt soldiers popping off rounds at the corporal's position, hooting and bouncing up and down, as they enjoyed the torment of their quarry. "You won't be so smug in a second shit for brains," he muttered between gritted teeth and opened fire. The .50 caliber rounds exploded out of the modified chromium barrel of the sidearm and decimated the breathing tank of the closest grunt. The initial shot pierced a thumbnail-sized hole into its target, and the grunt disappeared in a freezing cloud of blue-green methane and alien viscera. The alien's fellow packmates didn't understand what just happened. They were so drunk on bloodlust from already killing so many human denizens that they failed to cover their flank. General Grant open-fired again, ripping a hole into the next grunt's scaly arm, the next few shots going wild. "Shit," he cursed to himself. There's a reason the pistol was nicknamed the hand cannon. He began to resettle his aim, but the lull in firing gave the remaining soldiers a moment to sober up and return fire. Plasma pistol rounds began to sear past, and a few rounds flew so close that the ozone over him sizzled and singed the hairs above his head. Grant dove to the ground and crawled farther behind the meager food cart until his line of sight on the enemy was obscured by a vehicle. Splashes of plasma continued to pepper the cracked road around him, bubbling and then glowing an angry, dull red. "Shit, shit, shit!" he shouted aloud and began to reach into his utility pouch. The general pulled out a fresh magazine and slid it into the magwell of the pistol, knowing he would need it the way things were shaping up. He stored the nearly empty magazine in a spare pouch for later. General Grant closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, willing himself to face the enemy. Elaine needed him. His son needed him. Courage mustered. The general wheeled on one knee, taking a tactical stance against the remaining throng of grunts. His eyes widened. There were more now. At first 6, but now there were 4 times that. Knowing the food cart in front of him, now on fire from the plasma strikes, wouldn't conceal him much longer, General Grant sprang into action and darted for the nearest intact vehicle. He sprinted, glancing once over his shoulder to see an angry mob of grunt warriors raising their arms to fire at him. He dove behind a civilian leisure vehicle and felt the blistering heat on his back. Grant stood in a low crouch, looking now through the cracked windows of the car. He began to raise his sidearm again, and felt a searing pain in the center of his back. The frantic general glanced back from his target and saw the lick of a small flame emanating from the center of his back. "Shit!" he exclaimed and flopped onto his back. Rolling from side to side, General Grant struggled to take off his field jacket under the mass of his plate carrier. He stood up and patted the searing hole where his utilities once were. He spun around, aware that the mob might easily catch up and overrun his poor excuse for a fighting position. He took aim down his iron sights and leaned over the side of the car. Before he could start squeezing the trigger, the sound of automatic fire emanated from Corporal Valdez's position once again. The general looked a block down the street to see the Marine hosing sheets of fire over the grunts like a lead blanket. After a moment, the non-com ceased fire. He took this opportunity to hail someone, anyone, that was in the vicinity who could help them out. "This is General Michael Grant, Commanding General of the Boundary Militia. Requesting immediate support to my position. All channels, I am under attack. Requesting immediate support. Over." Standing up briefly to fire his pistol at a few stray Covenant, he could see Valdez still holding his position down the street. He ducked back behind the car to repeat his distress call over the radio. Nothing. He tried again, but this time a female voice filled his earpiece. "This is Sierra 065 to Grant, over." Sierra 065 referred to Sheila 065. She must have been monitoring the command channel, or his signal was being relayed from another outpost. Teal 3. My wife's convoy was under attack. I know, it was stupid, but I had to help. His sentence was cut off by a plasma bolt striking the hood of the car near centimeters from his head. Globules of molten metal rained down around him and came to rest on the concrete, taking shape into angry, dull red marbles. Could use some support. There are no other units in the immediate vicinity to assist. My driver and I are on our own. Holding down the finger to his earpiece and distracted, he blindly fired over the melted hood of the car, offering his only protection. There's another platoon a few blocks from us, but I don't think they'll be of much help. They're pinned down too. Requesting immediate extract. Track my... Out of nowhere, an ungainly creature clambered on top of the melted hood. It wore a breathing mask that obscured the bizarre feature of its face, and a quick puff of foul-smelling gas excreted from the filters on either side of a stubby nose. The general fell back on his haunches and landed on the plasma that still seared with white-hot pain. The grunt squealed in its foreign tongue at the militia leader and jumped on top of him. The grunt began to bang his fists onto his chest, landing blow after blow to his exposed sternum. Unable to move from the dead weight of the nearly 2-meter-tall creature, the best he could do was roll to his side enough, he hoped, to reach for the pistol which clattered away from his grasp when the thing landed on him. Outstretching his free arm and continuing to take blows to his sides, he put one finger into the trigger guard of the pistol. The index finger found purchase, and he yanked on the metal. The pistol slid right next to his face, now shoved into the crumbling concrete beneath him. Between blows from the grunt, he wrapped his free hand now around the pistol's grip and wrenched his wrist backward. He grunted from the effort of contorting his body so awkwardly and pulled the trigger. He fired and fired again. He fired until the empty click sounded from the last drop of the hammer that failed to cycle another armor-piercing round. He blinked and licked his lips, spitting a repugnant taste from his mouth. The grunt lay dead before him in a heap. The carcass of the crazed alien was teetering on one side of its oversized methane tank. Grant took a moment to catch his breath, wincing from the pain in his chest. The crazed grunt had landed several blows directly on his sternum, bruises undoubtedly already forming on his chest. He hastily rubbed his chest a few times to ease the pain developing in his thorax and pushed a finger to his ear. "We'll be heading to the Springfield Municipal Bank south by southeast of my current position. Hope to see you there, Spartans." Grant out. The general began to stand up in a daze and risked a look down the boulevard. Thankful to see that Corporal Valdez was still alive, he concentrated on the Marine and noticed he was shouting something. "Sir," Valdez shouted. "Get here, I'll cover." Without a second thought, he began to sprint down the sidewalk of the boulevard. He knew if he didn't move now, he'd be cut off from the only help he was going to get. Dodging more plasma fire and several uncomfortably close needler shards. He finished the dash to his original position next to the burning warthog. He leaned out from behind the wrecked food cart. Grant fired off a few wild rounds to ease the suppressive fire over the corporal's head. The ploy worked, giving Valdez time to expose himself long enough to arc a grenade toward the grunts. Thankfully, Grant saw the matte brown sphere roll to the middle of the grunt's feet in time to duck behind the food stand. An explosion rang out, filling the narrow street with debris and a plume of ashy gray smoke. He got up, assessed the carnage before him, and decided it was time to press on. There were still grunt warriors scattered in the street, but many were disoriented or too shocked to understand what was happening. This gave the general enough time to stride the remaining dozen meters to Valdez's position, and for the non-com to fire a full magazine into the remaining handful of aliens. Out of breath, he placed both hands on his knees in the relative safety afforded by Corporal Valdez. It had been a long time since he'd been in combat, and almost as long since he'd hit the gym. If they ever made it out of here, the track would be calling his name. Thanks, Corporal. I didn't have time to warn you of those bastards before we rolled over that grenade back there. I saw them too, sir. It was my fault, though. I was going too fast. It was stupid. He looked down at his boots. The kid was clearly beating himself up and must have felt responsible for his gunner's death. We can't worry about it now, Corporal. What's done is done. Come now. He jogged over to the burning warthog they came in and picked up the fallen militiaman's rifle and unceremoniously stripped the body of a few magazines and grenade. There's a bank just around the block to the south, just down the road. Should be able to hold off in there long enough for help to arrive. Grant slung the rifle from the fallen soldier while Corporal Valdez caught up. Hopefully this kid looked better than he did, he thought as they began to jog in tandem around the boulevard's promenade and south toward the bank. They arrived only a few moments later to the abandoned bank. During peacetime, hell, a few hours ago, this would have been a sprawling and thriving center of entertainment and commerce. The bank was near the center of Sanctuary and housed contracts on some of the most lucrative tracks on the planet. Now it was a ghost town. Cautiously and quietly, they made their way up the neatly polished steps that ascended the entrance to the bank. They entered the massive steel doors and found no one in sight. I called in our position. A special operations team are on their way as we speak, Corporal, Grant said. He didn't know who he was reassuring, the junior Marine or himself. We need to dig in, fortify the exits, and sit tight. Yes, sir, Valdez responded and got to work. He slung his rifle and began pushing a desk toward the door. I'll take first watch in case a Kavi tries to crash the gates, Grant said. Swap out when you need a break. Pistol in hand, he rested his arms on a nearby counter and watched the massive doors for any sign of trouble. While observing the large fire doors, he took the respite in fighting to try and raise Governor Huxley. He knew by now that she was probably expecting the worst, especially after how he stormed off just an hour before. Damn it, Melissa, I need to find her, he had said to an exasperated staffer and the governor. Without so much as a rebuttal, more like stunned silence, he had grabbed his sidearm, a few magazines from his desk, and a portable but high-power handheld radio and stormed off. Ma'am, he started. Now that he had a moment to reflect on his actions, he was at a loss for words. I'm sorry for my rash behavior back there. It's just, I've lost one son. I can't let it happen again. The words made his soul feel as damaged as his chest and back were. He didn't even know if she could hear him, but he continued anyways. First on Hat Yai and now Boundary. The weight of failure weighed on his shoulders like a Spartan was standing on him. All he wanted was what was best for his planet and his family. His people, damn it. The radio became more like a mobile confessional box. The Marine veteran was treating the handheld communications device more like a vessel to absolve him of guilt and sin than a life-saving menial piece of field equipment. I just want to let you know I'm sorry. I'm sorry these genocidal monsters came to our planet. I'm sorry for abandoning the position you needed me in the most. He trailed off. A tear was welling in the corner of his eye. He forced it back down. And most of all, I'm sorry that I might not make it back to my wife and child. If you hear from them, please tell Elaine and Daniel that I'm sorry I couldn't protect them better. He pulled a weak finger off the transmitter and slumped into a nearby chair. Grant reached back to his hip and retrieved the sidearm from its holster. drawing back the slide to reveal a copper-jacketed round situated in the chamber. He released the slide again, satisfied. He didn't really need to inspect the weapon, but anything was worth distracting himself for a few moments. The pair continued the watch for some time, only stopping to swap places, building up the barricade when the other was tired. They only had to hold out for maybe a few hours before the Spartans would swoop in to the rescue. So for now, their best bet was to sit tight and bunder down. Going back out on the streets now would be a death sentence. As he took his turns watching the door, he could hear the faint screams and cries of both civilian and soldier alike. General Grant hefted another desk piece over his waist and hoisted it on top of the growing pile of clutter which served as a barricade. He was about to call it quits on his turn, already maneuvering several sturdy wooden desks into position in front of the doors to the bank, when he heard a thunderous roar above his head. Without warning, the walls came crashing in around him, metal and wood splinters peppering his body in a chaotic flurry of destruction. He braced his stance and raised both arms over the desk to protect himself. Unable to do anything but brace himself for the collapse, the old general decided to crouch under the makeshift desk barricade in hopes of eluding the falling marble ceiling. The world literally and figuratively was crashing down around. Thudding erupted directly over his head. The marble fragments splintering to pieces was the only thing saving him from being buried alive. He redoubled his efforts to support the collapsing desk overhead and muttered a silent prayer. A floodgate of debris intensified above the ground floor of the bank. The culprit. Several plasma mortar rounds from what the UNSC called wraith tanks. Through cracks and holes, one could see streaks of dazzling blue-white light, like miniature suns streaking through the night sky. The plasma mortar projectiles arched through the air toward their intended targets. This time, it seemed, was the bank in which General Grant resided. He didn't know why they'd chosen a random abandoned building, but he supposed it didn't matter. He would die here now, nonetheless. He closed his eyes as the falling debris began to break through the desk, the only thing between him and never seeing his family again. His body shook violently now as he started to feel the impact of the stones and boulders. 1, 2, then 3 deadly rocks pelted his arms and face, rendering him unconscious. The man lay buried under the bank's ceiling, pieces of so much rock and stone and wood trapping him in a shallow tomb.